Hey class, in this video we are going to be going over making art for NPCs. So this includes a couple of things. First, the NPC world animations, the characters that we'll see as we're in the world of the game, like walking around or jumping on platforms. But then we're also going to create portraits or close-up images of the NPC to show during a dialogue scene. So in this particular case, when we talk about NPCs, we're more kind of talking about characters that you can have interactions with as far as like having dialogues with, as opposed to the enemies that we created in the other lab. Of course, you could kind of combine those two things. You might have NPCs that are also enemies or have different behaviors as well. But for this one, we're just going to be focusing on that dialogue. We're also going to add some portraits for the player. And we're going to make a little arrow to advance the dialogue. That's just something that we want to add for the dialogue system that we're going to use in Godot. And that goes along with the dialogue systems and add-ons lab for the developer area. So if you want to collaborate with a developer, this would be a good way to do that. You could create the art for the NPCs and they could use that art in that developer lab. So we're just going to make some art in Pascal and then post it on the Open Lab. Feel free to use other programs, especially for the portraits. That could be a good chance to use more detail and do more with the art than you can do for the game animations and graphics. So let's get started. All right, so to get started, I'm going to open up my MMP 270 folder and go to my artist folder, and I'm going to make a new folder for my NPCs. Okay, so I like to keep things nice and organized. I'm going to put the new graphics for my NPCs in here. So I do want my NPC art to look similar stylistically to my original character animation. So I'm going to go to the character animation page and find the example of my character, and I'll just open this up and kind of move it over here as a little reference when I make the first design. So the next thing I want to do is open up Pascal. I'm going to resize this so I can still see my character art over here. And I'm just going to go to resize, and I want this to match the size of the character, which was 64 by 64. So I'm going to change this and click resize. And I'm going to do something kind of similar to this character. You may have other ideas about what you want your NPCs to look like. They might not look similar to your character at all. Whatever you want to do is absolutely fine. For the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to make something pretty quick and simple. So I'm just going to use a similar style to the character, and I'm going to use a similar approach where I'm going to make a little guide and then draw over it. So I'm going to start by making a little circle for the head. And so I'll do a circle instead of a rectangle for this one. And then I'll do a triangle body again. So I'm just going to use some straight lines, do a little triangle body. And that looks pretty good. I'm just going to draw over this. So I'm going to go to a new frame and turn on the onion skin. And so now I'm going to choose a color for my NPC. So if you want, you could use something neutral like white. And that way you could change the color in Godot. And that would make it so you could have a lot of different NPCs. You can always change the color later. So I'm going to go with a different color for my NPC. So my main character is kind of pink. So for my NPC, maybe I'll make something that's kind of blue. Nice light blue. And I'm going to do a similar thing where I have a darker blue for the eyes of the NPC. So I'm going to draw, oops, let's turn on my pen. I'm going to draw the outline. So I'll draw around this and just kind of make it a little bit more rough and cut off the edges of this triangle a little bit. And that looks pretty good. Let's fill that in. So I'm going to use the bucket tool, and then I'll turn off the onion skin. And that's a decent sort of outline for the NPC. I could spend more time on this, but I think this is pretty good to get started. So let's draw some feet and some legs. So we just need a couple of simple feet down here. And in this example, the NPC is not really going to be doing much. They're just going to be kind of standing around, and then they'll talk to the player if the player approaches them. If you want your NPC to walk and do other things like that, you can set that up programmatically. I'm not going to go over that in this demo, but you could do that using some of the obstacle or enemy code that we have covered in some of the other projects. And so you could add a walk animation and an attack animation and other things like that if you want to add that functionality to your NPC. For now, I'm just going to focus on the dialogue aspect. So I'm just going to make a simple design. So let's give him some arms. I'm doing something very similar to the main player character in this case. So they'll look like they kind of come from the same world. I'm going to do the eyes now. So I'm going to choose a darker version of this blue and just draw some eyes. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and save this as kind of my default where all of my animations will start from. So I'll call this NPC default. If you have multiple NPCs, you might want to give it a specific name, but for me, I'm just going to do one. So I'm just going to call this NPC default and click Save As. And so I'll go to my NPCs and I'll save this. And now I'm going to move on to a couple of the animations. So I'm going to save this again. I'm going to save this as NPC idle. And I'm going to click Save As. So remember in Pascal, if I don't click Save As, it doesn't really save it. It's just going to overwrite that default. That's not the end of the world. We can fix that, but I want to make sure that this says NPC idle after I save it. So we'll stick with this, and I'm just going to add a couple frames. In one frame, let's make the NPC wave a bit. So I'm just going to erase a little bit here. And I'm just going to have him waving his hand. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to make this like really, really simple. That's all I'm going to do. And we'll set up that animation in Godot later. So obviously you could have more frames for this, but we just want something for the NPC to be doing. So in Godot, I'll just kind of flash to that frame and then go to something else. For this one, I'm going to fill in these eyes and do a blinking animation again. So I'll just do a little blink with the two eyes. And let's see what that looks like in our preview window. And so that gives us enough for the NPC to kind of have some life. So I'm pretty good with that. So I'm going to save that. And now I need to export this as a sprite sheet. So I'm going to go to export and I'm going to choose PNG and click download in sprite sheet. And so I will go back to my artist folder, get my NPCs. I want to call this NPC idle. I'm not sure why it has a 1 there. I might have saved something else earlier. So let's just save that. And so let's take a look. So now I have my NPC idle sprite sheet. So nothing too fancy, but we can make this a little more interesting with Godot. And that's enough to kind of build out an idle animation. So let's go back and let's save again. And this time I'm going to save my talk animation. So I'm going to click Save As. This is NPC talk. And I'm going to delete these 2 frames. And I'm just going to make a few frames here and just draw different mouths. So I'll draw a few different versions of the mouth so I can animate it like the NPC is talking. So we'll start with just a basic mouth and maybe an open mouth and maybe a crazy mouth and then maybe another mouth. And this is actually just going to be kind of going on in the background of our main dialogue, but we're going to use this in a second to make our actual dialogue. So I'm going to save this. And I'm going to export my sprite sheet. So I'll click Save. And so now we have the 2 sprite sheets for talking and idle, and we have all our Pascal files as well. So now what we need is the character portraits that will be used during the actual dialogue scene. So in Godot, when we go to a dialogue scene, there'll be a larger version of the character where you'll be able to see more detail and you can change the expression as they're talking through the dialogue. So we want to make what we'll call those portraits. So we want to make those for our NPC. And you don't necessarily need it depending on how your game is set up. If your character doesn't actually have to talk, then you might not need your character, but I'm going to make it for the character as well. And I'm basically going to use a really simple process where I'm just going to blow up the face of the 2 characters. This might be a good opportunity for some of the more seasoned artists in the class to make a really detailed drawing, since you don't have to worry so much about making an animation. A lot of you guys made really amazing character studies, and so you can make a much more detailed drawing in this case because you don't have to worry about creating lots of frames. You can just do a few expressions. So I'm just going to do 3 expressions. So there's a little variety that I can use in the dialogue tree, but you can feel free to do more than that or add different types of things that might happen in your dialogue depending on what you plan to do in the game. So I'm going to go back to Pascal and I'm going to save as again, and I'm going to call this NPC Portraits and click Save As. And I want to save that Pascal file. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to use the same faces that I already created, but I'm going to select and I'm going to make a selection on the body and just cut. And if I go to the next frame, I can just cut the exact same part of each character. So now I have my face of my character. So now we just have the expressions. So now I'm going to use the align image to center, and I'm going to hold shift so that each of another frames will be centered. And then I'm also going to crop. So now I'm actually going to resize this. So I'm going to make the character much bigger, and I'm going to do 128 for the width and resize the canvas content and click resize. And so now you can see the preview is much bigger. I might want to go larger than that. when we go over to Godot, you might say, oh, this needs to be bigger. And if that's the case, you can just come back to Pascal and increase the size. So this looks good. One thing I have to do is I don't want a sprite sheet here because of the way that the dialog system is set up. So when I go to export, I'm going to go to zip, and I want to give this a good prefix so it's easy to find. So I'm going to say NPC Portraits and put a little underscore there and download the zip. And I can save it in the same folder. And so now when we go back here, I have this zip file. And if I open that up, you can see we have each one of our expressions as a different image. So that's how we need to have it set up for when we go over to Godot. So next, this is optional. As I mentioned, you don't need to do this, but you might want to with your player. So I'm going to go back to Pascal and go to open. And I'm going to go grab my old player talk animation that I made a while back. So I'll look for that one in here. There we go. And I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did with my NPC. So I'm going to save as character portraits and save as. And I'll save that in the character animation. That's fine. So I'll click save. And I have a bunch of them with my character. I don't really need this many, but there's no reason to delete them. So again, I'm just going to use the selection tool. I'm going to select most of the character's body and just delete it on each one of my frames. And now I'll center all the frames holding shift, and I'll crop. And we can see the preview here is very small. So let's go to resize. I'm going to use the same width, 128. The character has a little bit more of a narrow head, so we might want to change some stuff for that, but I think this is pretty good. So that's much bigger. That's what I want. And so again, I'm going to go to export a zip, and I'm going to call this character portraits. And I'm going to download a zip. And I'll save that in my character animation folder. You might want to create like a whole separate folder for your dialogue animations and portraits. If you want to do that, you can do that, of course, but I'm just going to put this in the character animation with the rest of my character stuff. And so there are my character portraits. And so I've got a few different portraits to show during the dialogue. There's one more little thing that I want to do, and that's replacing the arrow in Dialogic. If you take a look at this example from the programming lab where we actually set up the dialogue, you can see that there is a default image for this Dialogic add-on. And it looks okay, but I want to have an arrow that matches my artwork, and maybe you can make it point to the right or something like that. You don't necessarily have to use the same thing that they're using. So I'm going to go back to Pascal and just create a new sprite. And I'm going to save this as dialog arrow, and I'll click save as, and I'll put this in the NPC folder. There isn't really a better folder to put it in. Let's make it a little bit smaller. We don't need it to be super big, so we'll do 16 by 16. And I'm just going to basically draw a little arrow to indicate to go to the next dialogue. So I'm going to make a slightly larger pen and just draw an arrow pointing down. And it's really pretty simple. It doesn't really have to look perfect, but I just want something other than the default graphics. And maybe I can choose a color that matches the player a little bit. So that looks pretty good. And so now I'm just going to save that and I'll export. And this is just one PNG. It's pretty simple, but I'll just leave that in my NPC folder so I can use that in my game later. So that's everything I need to do for this lab. So let's go to the Open Lab. So on the Open Lab, I'll go to Post. I'm going to go to Category first and search for NPCs. And let's call this NPC Art. So we want to post our two animations. So we'll say NPC Idle and Talk sprite sheets. And of course, if your NPC does more things besides sit around and talk, you can add other sprite sheets as well. So we'll go with the NPC Idle and the NPC Talk. And then we can say NPC Dialog Portraits. And you might want to include your character portraits here as well, but you don't need to. So I'm going to drop these in as a little gallery. Oh, got stuck up here. So let's tell it not to crop the images. I'm still trying to make these galleries work. Let's see if it looks okay. So let's preview. And that looks pretty good. So, if you want to write about your inspiration like you did for the character design, feel free to include more in your post for your documentation, but this is basically what we need for the assignment. So I'm going to go ahead and publish.